The last kidnapper hit the concrete with a wet thud, his tactical vest useless against Lucas Crawford's precise strike to the carotid artery. Steam rose from their unconscious bodies in the cold warehouse air, mingling with the metallic scent of fear and diesel fuel. Cassandra Reed pressed her back against the shipping container, designer silk torn at the shoulder, watching this unassuming mechanic wipe blood from split knuckles with the same casual efficiency he might use to clean motor oil. Her chest rose and fell in sharp bursts as Lucas holstered a pistol he'd stripped from one of her captor's movement's fluid. Practiced. Nothing like the gentleman who'd changed her flat tire 3 hours ago. The silence stretched between them, broken only by distant sirens and the steady drip of condensation from rusted beams overhead. When she finally whispered, "Who are you really?" Lucas froze, his hand halfway to his phone. Because in that warehouse, surrounded by unconscious professionals who knew exactly where to find them both, he'd just made the one mistake he'd sworn never to make again. And the woman staring at him with those wide, terrified eyes had no idea that saving her life might have just destroyed everything he'd sacrificed 13 years to protect. 3 hours earlier, Lucas had been lying under Mrs. Peterson's rusted Honda Civic, cursing the stripped oil drain plug that would cost him another hour he couldn't afford to lose. The auto shop's radio crackled with afternoon talk shows, while fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting harsh shadows across concrete floors stained with decades of motor oil and broken dreams. His phone vibrated against his hip, another overdue notice, probably the electric company this time. Mason's school supplies list sat crumpled in his pocket, $27 worth of items that might as well have been $27,000. The wrench slipped from his oil-slicked fingers, clattering to the floor as he squeezed his eyes shut and tried to forget the taste of MREs and the weight of night vision goggles. Some ghosts refused to stay buried, no matter how deep you dug their graves. The bell above the shop door chimed, followed by the distinct click of expensive heels on concrete. Lucas rolled out from under the Honda, wiping his hands on coveralls that had seen better decades, and found himself staring at legs that belonged in boardrooms, not budget auto shops. Cassandra Reed stood in the doorway, her tailored suit somehow making the grimy waiting area look even more pathetic than usual. She clutched a leather purse worth more than Lucas made in 3 months, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against its surface with nervous energy. Her BMW sat outside with a flat rear tire, steam rising from under the hood like a white flag of surrender. "I know this isn't exactly your usual clientele," she said, her voice carrying the soft authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "But my regular place is closed, and I have a meeting I absolutely cannot miss." The way she said it suggested missing meetings was not something Cassandra Reed did often, if ever. Lucas nodded toward the service bay, professional habit overriding the instinct to explain that women like her didn't usually need his help. As he jacked up her car, she paced behind him, phone pressed to her ear in heated whispers about board meetings and quarterly projections that didn't add up. The tire had been slashed, not punctured, a clean, deliberate cut that made the hair on Lucas's neck stand up like a dog sensing danger. He'd seen enough sabotage in Iraq to recognize it when civilian tools were involved, and this cut was surgical in its precision. "Miss Reed," he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge that made her stop mid-sentence and end her call. "When did you first notice the tire was flat?" She turned to face him fully, something in his tone apparently cutting through her corporate armor like a blade through silk. "About 10 minutes ago. In the parking garage at my office. Why? Lucas examined the wheel well, fingers tracing scratches in the paint that spoke of professional surveillance equipment recently removed. The first bullets shattered the shop's front window before she could process his answer. Lucas tackled her behind the hydraulic lift as automatic weapons fire stitched across the wall where her head had been seconds earlier, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. Shards of glass rained down like deadly confetti, while the radio's afternoon programming dissolved into static and sparks that cast eerie shadows across the walls. She screamed, the sound sharp and primal, nothing like the controlled executive who'd walked through his door minutes ago, with quarterly reports and board meetings on her mind. "Stay down," Lucas commanded, his voice shifting into something she'd never heard before. Calm, authoritative, deadly as winter steel. He low-crawled to his toolbox, fingers closing around the Glock he'd promised himself he'd never need again. Its weight familiar in his palm like shaking hands with an old enemy. The transformation was instant and terrifying mechanic to warrior in the space of a heartbeat. Lucas counted 3 distinct footfall patterns outside, weapons discipline suggesting professional military training rather than common criminals looking for a quick score. He caught Cassandra's wrist, guiding her toward the back exit while bullets sparked off metal equipment around them, each ricochet singing a song of violence and death. Her designer heels caught on an oil drain, sending her stumbling into his chest. And for a moment, he smelled expensive perfume mixed with fear and motor oil, an combination that shouldn't have worked, but somehow did. "Can you run in those shoes?" he whispered against her ear, his breath warm against skin that had never known this kind of terror. She kicked them off without hesitation, silk stockings immediately shredding against the concrete floor like a carefully constructed world. The rear door led to an alley that reeked of garbage and rain, but more importantly, it offered 3 potential escape routes that Lucas had memorized during his first week working here. "Point and squeeze," he said, pressing the Glock into her trembling hands, his fingers wrapping around hers to demonstrate proper grip. "Don't think, just survive." The black SUV that screeched into the alley confirmed Lucas's worst fears and answered questions he'd hoped never to face again. These weren't common criminals looking for a quick kidnapping. They moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit, communications equipment visible in their earpieces, weapons held with professional competence. He grabbed Cassandra's hand and pulled her toward the fire escape of the adjacent building, their bare feet and stocking-clad soles struggling for purchase on wet metal rungs slick with Pacific Northwest rain. Below them, tactical flashlights carved through shadows as their pursuers split up to cover potential escape routes with textbook efficiency. "Why are they trying to kill me?" Cassandra gasped as they reached the second-floor landing, her chest heaving with exertion and terror. Lucas glanced back at her torn suit and bleeding feet. This woman who'd walked into his shop looking for a simple tire change and found herself in the middle of a war she didn't understand. "Lady, I think the better question is why they knew exactly where to find you." The implications hung between them like smoke from a funeral pyre. The rooftop offered temporary sanctuary but no real escape, just a panoramic view of the industrial district stretching toward Portland's skyline like a concrete ocean under gathering storm clouds. Cassandra shivered in the evening air, her silk blouse providing little protection against the Pacific Northwest chill that cut through fabric like it wasn't there. Lucas stripped off his work shirt, revealing the network of scars across his back that told stories he'd never shared with anyone, not even Mason's teachers when they asked about his military service with careful, knowing looks. He draped the shirt around her shoulders, catching the way her eyes lingered on the shrapnel marks near his shoulder blade. Souvenirs from an IED that had taken his team leader's left leg. "Navy SEAL," he said quietly, answering the question she hadn't asked, but that hung in the air between them like incense. "Iraq, 2010 through 2015. Got out when he stopped, the words sticking in his throat like broken glass, some stories too heavy for strangers. She pulled his shirt tighter around herself, the fabric carrying the scent of motor oil and something indefinably masculine that made her feel safer than any corporate security team ever had. "Cassandra Reed, Reed Defense Technologies," she said, her voice barely audible above the wind that whistled through the urban canyon below them. "My father's company. We do government contracts, mostly overseas operations, supporting our troops wherever they need us." Lucas felt the world tilt sideways, his breath catching in his chest like he'd been sucker-punched by a ghost from his past. Reed Defense Technologies. The name that haunted his nightmares, printed on classified documents that had gotten his entire team killed in a village outside Mosul, where children should have been learning and instead found bullets. His hands began to shake, and not from the cold that bit through his undershirt like winter teeth. "Your father," he said slowly, each word carved from ice and 13 years of suppressed rage. "Jonathan Reed." The way her face changed told him everything he needed to know. "You know my father?" she asked, but something in Lucas's expression made her take a step back toward the rooftop's edge. His jaw had gone rigid, eyes distant in a way that suggested he was seeing ghosts instead of Portland's city lights twinkling like earth-bound stars. The tactical watch on his wrist military issue, she realized now, caught the ambient light as his fingers traced its face with unconscious precision. Muscle memory from counting down to operations that had ended in blood and sand. "Operation Iron Shield," he whispered, the words barely audible above the wind that carried the scent of river water and industrial decay. 2013. Your father's company provided intelligence for our mission. Bad intelligence." He looked up at her then, and she saw something in his eyes that made her stomach drop. Not anger, but something far worse, the kind of pain that carved itself into a man's soul and never let go. 7 good men died because Reed Defense gave us coordinates for a school instead of a weapons cache. The words hung between them like an accusation that could never be taken back. Cassandra's legs gave out, forcing her to sit hard on the rooftop's gravel surface that bit through her torn stockings like angry teeth. Her father's company had been built on defense contracts, government work that paid for her Stanford education and their family's estate in the hills outside Portland, where deer grazed in manicured gardens. She'd always assumed they were the good guys, protecting American interests overseas, keeping soldiers safe from the dangers that lurked in foreign shadows. "No," she breathed, shaking her head so hard her hair whipped across her face. "That's impossible. Dad would never—" But even as she said it, she remembered the late-night phone calls in languages she didn't recognize, the locked filing cabinets in his home office, the way he'd grown increasingly paranoid over the past few years, the board meetings she wasn't allowed to attend, the contracts she wasn't cleared to review despite her MBA and executive position. Lucas watched her world crumble with something that might have been sympathy if he hadn't buried his capacity for forgiveness in a mass grave outside Mosul, where 7 good men had died for corporate profits. I've been investigating him for 2 years, she admitted, her voice hollow as a tomb. Financial irregularities, off-books contracts, payments to companies that don't seem to exist anywhere outside of shell corporations and Swiss bank accounts. I thought he was just skimming money, maybe avoiding taxes like half the Fortune 500. She laughed, a sound entirely devoid of humor that echoed off the surrounding buildings like a dirge. I never imagined he was getting people killed. Lucas studied her face in the dim light, looking for signs of deception, and finding only devastating honesty that cut through his anger like sunlight through storm clouds. The woman shivering in his work shirt wasn't just Jonathan Reed's daughter. She was his unwitting enemy, gathering evidence that could finally bring him down. That's why they came for you today, he realized, pieces falling into place with terrible clarity. He found out about your investigation. She nodded, tears cutting tracks through the grime on her cheeks like rivers carving canyons through stone. I was supposed to present my findings to the board tomorrow morning. Someone leaked it to him. The irony wasn't lost on either of them, the daughter trying to expose her father's crimes, rescued by one of his victims. Below them, tactical flashlights swept the alley as their pursuers regrouped with the patience of professional hunters who knew their prey had nowhere left to run. Lucas could hear radio chatter, professional communications that suggested these weren't just hired muscle, but active military personnel operating outside official channels. The implications made his blood run cold. If Jonathan Reed had access to current military assets, his influence reached far deeper into the Pentagon than Lucas had imagined. We can't stay here, he said, helping Cassandra to her feet with gentle hands that had learned tenderness from 8 years of raising a son alone. Her stockings were shredded, feet bleeding from the rough rooftop gravel, but she didn't complain as he guided her toward salvation or damnation. At this point, the difference was academic. The fire escape on the building's far side led down to a loading dock where delivery trucks made their rounds, civilian vehicles that might offer temporary camouflage. Lucas counted seconds between radio transmissions, timing their descent to coincide with communication gaps, every Navy SEAL operation having taught him that silence was just as important as speed. They dropped from the fire escape into the cab of an 18-wheeler, the diesel engine's rumble masking the sound of their landing like thunder covering lightning strikes. The driver was asleep in the sleeper compartment, snoring loud enough to wake the dead, oblivious to the drama unfolding in his trailer. A small mercy in a night that had offered precious few. Lucas hot-wired the ignition with practiced efficiency, while Cassandra kept watch through side mirrors that reflected tactical flashlights sweeping the area like searchlights hunting escaped prisoners. The truck lurched forward with a pneumatic hiss, headlights cutting through the industrial darkness as they put distance between themselves and the auto shop that had become a war zone. In the passenger seat, Cassandra hugged his work shirt tighter around herself, the adrenaline crash leaving her shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice small and lost in the truck's mechanical rumble. Lucas checked the mirrors, looking for pursuit vehicles among the scattered traffic of evening commuters heading home to families who would never know how close they'd come to witnessing urban warfare. The abandoned warehouse district near the Columbia River had been Lucas's backup plan since moving to Portland 8 years ago, the kind of place where a man could disappear if his past finally caught up with him, like a creditor demanding payment in blood. Empty buildings lined the waterfront like broken teeth, their windows dark and their parking lots overgrown with weeds that pushed through cracked asphalt with the persistence of life refusing to surrender. He parked the stolen truck behind a loading dock that hadn't seen legitimate business in over a decade, the smell of rust and river water heavy in the air, like memories of industry long dead. Cassandra followed him through a gap in the chain-link fence, her bare feet picking their way carefully across debris-strewn concrete that told stories of economic collapse and urban decay. The warehouse he'd chosen had multiple exits and clear sight lines in all directions. Advantages he'd learned to appreciate in places where visibility meant survival and blind corners meant death. "Home sweet home," he said grimly, producing a key from his pocket that opened a side door marked with warnings about trespassing and prosecution that nobody would enforce. Inside, the warehouse was a study in controlled abandonment that spoke of careful preparation and paranoid planning. Lucas had spent months preparing this safe house, stockpiling supplies in shipping containers that looked empty from the outside, but contained everything needed for extended survival in a world that had turned hostile. Military-grade communications equipment, weapons that weren't supposed to exist in civilian hands, medical supplies, and enough food to last several weeks if necessary. The preparations of a man who knew that peace was temporary and violence was always lurking in the shadows. Cassandra stared at the organized efficiency of his preparations, understanding dawning in her eyes like sunrise over a battlefield. "You've been planning for something like this," she said, and it wasn't a question, but a statement of fact that hung in the air between them. Lucas activated a battery-powered heater, its gentle hum echoing off concrete walls as warmth began to chase away the river's chill that seeped through walls like despair through hope. "Your father destroyed my team, my career, my entire life," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of 13 years of suppressed rage. "But he made one mistake. He let me live." The medical kit contained antiseptic and bandages for Cassandra's feet, which had taken more damage than she'd admitted during their escape from a world gone mad in the space of an afternoon. Lucas worked with the clinical efficiency of a combat medic, cleaning wounds and applying pressure bandages while she gritted her teeth against the sting of antiseptic that burned like liquid fire. Her hands shook as the adrenaline finally wore off, leaving her with the full impact of what had happened and the terrible knowledge that her father, the man who'd taught her to ride a bicycle and helped with homework, was a monster. "They were really trying to kill me," she whispered, as if saying it aloud would make it more real than the nightmare she was desperately hoping to wake up from. Lucas nodded, securing the last bandage with medical tape, his touch gentle despite the violence that had brought them together. "Professional hit team, military training, real-time intelligence coordination," he said, listing the facts like evidence in a trial that would never see a courtroom. "Your father doesn't take chances when it comes to protecting his empire." He looked up at her, this woman who'd inherited a legacy of blood and betrayal without knowing the price that had been paid in foreign soil. "The question is, what are you going to do about it?" Cassandra pulled out her laptop, its screen casting blue light across the warehouse walls like electronic holy fire as she accessed files hidden behind layers of encryption that would make government cryptographers weep with envy. Financial records, contract documents, communication logs, years of evidence that painted a picture of systematic corruption reaching into the highest levels of government, like cancer metastasizing through healthy tissue. "I have everything," she said, her voice gaining strength as she focused on familiar data that made sense in a world that had suddenly stopped making any sense at all. payments to black sites that don't officially exist, funding for operations that appear in no government records, contracts for equipment that was never delivered to troops who died waiting for supplies that were sold to the highest bidder instead. Lucas studied the documents over her shoulder, his jaw tightening as he recognized operation codes from his own deployment, names of men who'd died because corporate profits mattered more than American lives. "That's my unit," he said, pointing to a file marked Iron Shield, Final Payment, with fingers that trembled with barely controlled rage. Reed Defense billed the Pentagon $3 million for successful mission completion. 7 dead soldiers, and they called it a success. But as Lucas scrolled through the files, his expression changed from anger to something darker, more complex. "These dates," he said slowly, his finger tracing a timeline that didn't match his memories. "Some of these operations happened after 2015, after I got out." Cassandra leaned closer, her perfume mixing with the warehouse's industrial smell as she followed his logic. "That's impossible. You said Iron Shield was 2013, but this shows payments continuing through 2017, 2019. Her voice trailed off as the implications sank in like stones through water. "Lucas, what if your team wasn't the end? What if it was just the beginning?" The laptop screen illuminated their faces as they stared at evidence of ongoing operations, current military units whose fates might already be sealed by Reed Defense's greed. Lucas felt his world shift again, the weight of 7 dead friends joined by the possibility of countless others. Soldiers who were walking into traps that hadn't been set yet, but would be, as surely as the sun would rise on another day of corporate-sponsored murder. The sound of vehicles approaching made them both freeze. Laptop screen reflected in Lucas's eyes as he processed the tactical situation with computer-like efficiency. Multiple engines, coordinated arrival patterns, the distinctive whine of military-grade communications equipment that sang songs of violence and professional death. Through dirty windows, tactical flashlights probed the warehouse complex like mechanical fingers, searching for any sign of their presence with the patience of predators who knew their prey was cornered. "They found us," Cassandra breathed, her face pale in the laptop's glow as she realized that running was no longer an option, if it ever had been. Lucas was already moving, gathering weapons and emergency supplies from hidden caches around the warehouse, his movements economical and deadly, as muscle memory took over from conscious thought. The Kevlar vest fit over his work clothes like a second skin, transforming him from protective father figure into something far more dangerous. "Not yet, they haven't," he said grimly, checking magazine loads and comm frequencies with the casual efficiency of a man preparing for war. "But they're about to wish they'd sent more men." The first breach came through the loading dock, shaped charges blowing the reinforced doors inward with controlled precision that spoke of military engineering and unlimited budgets. Lucas had anticipated this. The warehouse's layout funneled attackers through specific choke points, turning their superior numbers into a liability in the confined space. He positioned Cassandra behind a shipping container that would stop rifle rounds, her laptop and evidence files secured in a waterproof case that might survive even if they didn't. "Whatever happens," he told her, his hands gentle on her shoulders as he spoke words that might be their last conversation, "get that information to the authorities. Make sure the world knows what your father really is." She grabbed his arm as he turned to go, her fingers digging into his bicep with desperate strength. "Lucas, wait. I need you to know. I'm sorry. For what he did to your team, for what he took from you, for every life my family's money has destroyed. I'm sorry." He covered her hand with his, calloused fingers gentle against her smooth skin that had never known the texture of violence until tonight. "I know," he said simply, and the forgiveness in his voice was a gift she hadn't known she needed. "That's why I'm going to make sure you live to fix it." The first wave of attackers moved through the warehouse with textbook precision, flashbang grenades announcing their presence before automatic weapons fire lit up the darkness like deadly fireworks. Lucas had every advantage knowledge of the terrain, prepared positions, and the kind of focused rage that made men dangerous in ways their training manuals couldn't account for. He moved through shadows like smoke, appearing behind enemy positions to eliminate targets with cold efficiency before melting back into the maze of shipping containers and industrial equipment that had become his hunting ground. Each fallen attacker carried military-grade weapons and communications gear, confirming what Lucas already knew. Jonathan Reed had resources that reached far beyond corporate boardrooms into the heart of America's military apparatus. But as the body count rose, Lucas realized with growing dread that these weren't just mercenaries or even corrupt soldiers. They were current active duty personnel, men who believed they were conducting a legitimate operation against terrorist threats. Reed's influence was deeper and more poisonous than even Lucas had imagined, turning America's finest against their own citizens in service of corporate greed. The tactical situation deteriorated rapidly as more vehicles arrived, disgorging professional soldiers who moved with the coordinated precision of a special operations unit conducting a hostage rescue rather than an assassination. Lucas counted at least 15 hostiles, all equipped with night vision and real-time communications, all willing to kill an American citizen to protect Jonathan Reed's secrets, though they probably believed they were saving lives instead of ending them. From her position behind the shipping container, Cassandra could hear the firefight raging through the warehouse-controlled bursts of automatic weapons fire, punctuated by the sharp crack of Lucas's rifle as he picked off targets with surgical precision born of years in places where hesitation meant death. The laptop screen showed incoming messages from her assistant, the board of directors, reporters who'd somehow gotten wind of the story despite the careful secrecy she'd maintained. The outside world was beginning to take notice, which meant Reed's window for quietly eliminating problems was rapidly closing. But it also meant the stakes were higher than ever, corporate survival demanding more extreme measures. "Dad," she whispered to the empty air, "what have you become?" A new sound cut through the gunfire, the distinctive whine of rotor blades as military helicopters approached from the river like mechanical angels of death. Lucas had hoped for more time, but Reed's resources were apparently unlimited when it came to protecting his empire of blood and corruption from the consequences of its own actions. Spotlights blazed through the warehouse windows as the helicopters took positions around the building, their downdraft stirring up decades of dust and debris that turned the air into a choking cloud. "Time to go," Lucas called to Cassandra, his voice barely audible over the mechanical thunder above them that promised swift and violent resolution. She grabbed the laptop case and followed him toward a maintenance tunnel that led to the storm drain system beneath the warehouse complex, her bandaged feet struggling for purchase on concrete, slick with condensation and fear. Behind them, rappelling ropes dropped through skylights as Special Forces operators prepared for a full-scale assault on what should have been a simple kidnapping operation but had become something far more complex and dangerous. The irony wasn't lost on Lucas' elite American soldiers, the best of the best, hunting down the very people trying to expose corruption that was getting their brothers killed overseas. The storm drains beneath Portland's industrial district were Lucas's final contingency, a network of concrete tunnels that connected to the river and offered multiple escape routes through the city's underground arteries. Cold water ran ankle-deep through the main channel, carrying the scent of urban decay and industrial runoff toward the Columbia River that had witnessed the rise and fall of Oregon's industrial dreams. Cassandra struggled to keep up, her bandaged feet slipping on algae-covered concrete as emergency lighting cast strange shadows on tunnel walls that seemed to close in around them like the walls of a tomb. Above them, the warehouse erupted in gunfire as Reed's mercenaries discovered their escape route. But the storm drains were built to withstand flooding rifle rounds, couldn't penetrate reinforced concrete designed to channel an entire river's worth of water during the worst Pacific storms. "Almost there," Lucas said, his voice echoing off tunnel walls as they approached a maintenance ladder that led to street level 6 blocks from the warehouse, where civilian life continued in blissful ignorance of the war being fought beneath their feet. But as they climbed toward the surface, Cassandra felt something inside her break. Not her spirit, but her illusions about family, loyalty, and the price of doing what was right when everything you'd believed turned out to be built on lies. They emerged through a storm drain cover in the parking lot of an all-night diner, its neon sign casting pink and blue light across wet asphalt like artificial aurora borealis. Lucas helped Cassandra climb out of the tunnel, both of them soaked and shivering in the Pacific Northwest rain that had begun to fall like tears from an indifferent sky. Through the diner's windows, they could see truckers and night shift workers nursing coffee and watching news reports on a wall-mounted television, their faces illuminated by images of the warehouse firefight that was already being spun as a terrorist incident. The breaking news banner read, "Explosion and gunfire at Portland warehouse. Terrorist cell eliminated." But the reporters had no idea they were witnessing the opening shots of a war between a corrupt defense contractor and the man whose team he'd destroyed. "We need to get to a phone," Cassandra said, water dripping from her hair as she clutched the laptop case like a lifeline. The FBI. The media. Someone who can't be bought. But even as she said it, she wondered if such people still existed in a world where her father could turn American soldiers against American citizens with a few phone calls and the right operational briefing. Lucas studied her face in the neon light. This woman who'd lost everything in a single evening, but was still fighting to do the right thing, and felt something shift inside his chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but something close enough to matter. The payphone outside the diner was a relic from another era, its metal surface scarred by weather and vandalism, but still functional in a digital world that had forgotten the value of anonymous communication. Lucas fed quarters into the slot while Cassandra opened her laptop, connecting to the diner's unsecured Wi-Fi to upload files to secure servers scattered across 3 continents. Insurance against the possibility that they wouldn't survive the night to tell their story. Each document that uploaded was another nail in Jonathan Reed's coffin, evidence that would survive even if they didn't, a digital legacy of corporate crime that no amount of money or influence could erase. "FBI tip line," a voice answered, professional and alert despite the late hour that had stretched into early morning without either of them noticing. I need to report corruption in defense contracting and the murder of American soldiers overseas, Cassandra said, her voice steady, despite everything they'd been through. The corporate executive finally finding her footing in a crisis that demanded leadership, rather than quarterly projections. My name is Cassandra Reed, and I have documentary evidence that Reed Defense Technologies has been systematically defrauding the Pentagon while getting our troops killed for profit. The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds before the agent began asking questions that would ultimately bring down an empire built on betrayal and watered with blood. But as federal agents arrived at the diner in unmarked vehicles 20 minutes later, their badges and professional demeanor a sharp contrast to the mercenaries who'd been hunting them through Portland's streets, Cassandra felt doubt creeping in like fog from the river. Special Agent Martinez of the FBI's Corporate Crimes Division studied the laptop files with the focused intensity of someone who'd been waiting years for exactly this kind of break. But her questions grew increasingly pointed as she examined the evidence. "This is enough to charge Jonathan Reed with treason," she said quietly, scrolling through contracts that detailed payments for fabricated intelligence and equipment that was never delivered to troops in combat zones. "But we'll need you both to testify, and that means witness protection until we can guarantee your safety." The words hung in the air like a sentencing, and Cassandra realized with growing horror that cooperating with the FBI meant destroying not just her father, but potentially dozens of innocent Reed Defense employees, people who'd worked in good faith without knowing their paychecks were bought with soldiers' blood. Lucas watched her face change as the full implications sank in, understanding the weight of choices that had no good answers, only different degrees of necessary evil. 3 days later, in the sterile conference room of a federal safe house outside Portland, Cassandra sat surrounded by FBI agents and federal prosecutors, while her father's voice crackled through speakerphones that carried his words like poison through the air. Jonathan Reed had agreed to a recorded conversation with his daughter, ostensibly to negotiate her cooperation in exchange for lenient treatment, but really to make one final attempt at controlling the narrative of his own destruction. "Cassandra, sweetheart." His voice carried the same paternal warmth that had comforted her through childhood nightmares, now twisted into something that made her skin crawl. "I know this looks bad, but you have to understand, everything I did was to protect American interests, to keep our soldiers safe from threats the politicians were too weak to acknowledge." Lucas sat beside her, his presence a steady anchor as her world continued to collapse, his hand finding hers under the table when her father's justifications became too much to bear alone. "Dad," she said into the microphone, her voice breaking despite her attempts at control. 7 men died because of your lies. How many more are dying right now because of contracts you signed?" The silence that followed stretched like a gulf between them, filled with the weight of choices that could never be undone. "You always were too idealistic," Jonathan Reed finally said, his voice shifting from paternal warmth to the cold calculation that had built his empire on the graves of better men. "Sometimes protecting America means making hard choices that bleeding hearts like you will never understand. Those soldiers signed up to die for their country. I just made sure their sacrifice served a larger purpose." Cassandra felt something inside her break completely, not her resolve, but her last connection to the man who'd raised her, taught her to drive, walked her down the aisle at her college graduation. "What larger purpose?" she asked, her voice steady now, with a fury that burned cold and clean. "Your bank account? Your stock options? Your board positions?" Lucas squeezed her hand as she continued, finding strength in shared grief and mutual determination. I'm going to destroy everything you built, Dad. Every contract, every connection, every corrupt dollar you've earned on the backs of dead soldiers. And I'm going to do it in their memory, especially the 7 men whose names you probably don't even remember. The recording equipment captured her father's laughter, a sound devoid of humor or humanity that would later be played in courtrooms as evidence of his complete moral bankruptcy. You think you can destroy me with your little investigation? Jonathan Reed's voice carried a confidence that chilled the federal agents listening to the conversation, suggesting resources and connections that reached far beyond what they'd imagined. I've been building this empire for 30 years, sweetheart. I have friends in places you can't even imagine. Debts owed and favors called in that stretch from the Pentagon to the Kremlin to palaces in Saudi Arabia, where oil money flows like water. Cassandra closed her eyes, finally understanding the true scope of what they were facing. Not just a corrupt defense contractor, but an international network of arms dealers, government officials, and corporate interests that treated human lives like accounting entries. Then I'll expose them all, she said quietly, her voice carrying a determination that surprised even her. Every name, every connection, every blood-soaked dollar. I'll burn it all down and salt the earth behind me. The line went dead as her father ended the call. But his final words echoed in the conference room like a curse. You have no idea what you've started, little girl. Or how many good people are going to die because of your naive crusade for justice. But Jonathan Reed had underestimated his daughter's resolve and Lucas's tactical experience, a combination that proved more dangerous than either man could have imagined. Working with federal investigators, they methodically dismantled the network of corruption that had taken decades to build, following money trails and communication logs that revealed a conspiracy reaching into the highest levels of multiple governments. Cassandra's business acumen, combined with Lucas's military knowledge of overseas operations, proved devastatingly effective at identifying patterns that individual investigators had missed. Each revelation led to new arrests, new seizures of assets, new evidence that painted an increasingly horrifying picture of systematic corruption that had cost thousands of lives across multiple continents. The safe house became a war room where corporate crime fighters and military investigators worked around the clock to build cases that would stand up in courts, both military and civilian, knowing that their window of opportunity was limited by Reed's vast network of connections and resources. 6 months later, the Reed Defense Technologies trial dominated headlines as the prosecution presented evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government and international arms dealing. Jonathan Reed sat in federal court wearing an orange jumpsuit, his empire of corruption reduced to a defendant's table, and the mounting testimony of victims whose voices had finally been heard after decades of silence. Cassandra took the stand wearing a simple black suit, her testimony clear and devastating, as she outlined years of evidence her father had never imagined she would find, much less understand. He believed he was above the law, she said, looking directly at the man who'd given her life and then tried to take it away. But the families of those 7 soldiers deserved better than lies and cover-ups, and so did the thousands of others who died because corporate profits mattered more than human lives. In the gallery, Lucas watched with Mason beside him, both of them understanding that justice was sometimes a long road but always worth traveling, no matter how many ghosts haunted the journey. The verdict was unanimous, guilty on all counts, including conspiracy, fraud, and accessory to murder across multiple jurisdictions. Jonathan Reed would spend the rest of his life in federal prison, his defense contracting empire dismantled and its assets distributed to the families of soldiers killed by his greed and incompetence. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed around Cassandra and Lucas, their questions a chaos of cameras and microphones that couldn't capture the quiet satisfaction of knowing that 7 good men and countless others had finally received the justice they deserved. "What's next for you both?" a reporter shouted over the crowd, expecting platitudes about healing and moving forward. Lucas put his arm around Mason's shoulders, the boy wearing his father's military dog tags with pride instead of shame, while Cassandra stood beside them as something more than an ally family forged in the crucible of shared trauma and mutual respect. "We're going home," Lucas said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a man who'd finally found peace. Because sometimes the greatest victory was not the battle you won, but the family you protected while fighting it. 1 year later, Cassandra Reed stood in the conference room of her new company, Phoenix Defense Consulting, surrounded by military advisors and government officials who understood that ethical defense contracting was not just possible, but necessary for national security. The company's mission statement hung framed on the wall. "Protecting those who protect us, with honor, integrity, and truth." Through her office window, she could see Lucas in the parking lot, picking up Mason from the company's childcare center, while wearing the security director badge that represented his official transition from haunted veteran to protector of those who served their country with honor. Their relationship had grown slowly, built on trust earned through shared trauma and mutual respect, the kind of love that emerged from ashes to create something stronger than either of them had thought possible after losing so much to one man's greed. "Every hero deserves a second chance," she had told him the night he'd finally agreed to stop running from his past and start building toward a future. And in the end, they had both discovered that some chances were worth fighting for, especially when the fight was for something larger than personal happiness, a chance to honor the dead by protecting the living.